John chapter 7, beginning in verse 14, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. About the middle of the festival, and this is the festival of Sukkot, the festival of booths, happens in the fall, 6 months after Passover. About the middle of the festival, Jesus went up into the temple and began to teach. The Jews were astonished at it, saying, "How does this man have such learning when he's never been taught?" Then Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. Anyone who resolves to do the will of God will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own. Those who speak on their own seek their own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and there's nothing false in him. Did not Moses give you the law? None of you keeps the law. Why are you looking for an opportunity to kill me?" The crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who's trying to kill you?" Jesus answered them, "I performed one work, and all of you are astonished. Moses gave you circumcision. It is, of course, not from Moses, but from the patriarchs. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath in order that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because I healed a man's whole body on the Sabbath? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." Today we're going to talk about the relationship between the Old Covenant of Moses, the law of Moses, the law that we find in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and the New Covenant of Jesus, articulated in the Gospels and summarized, I think, in Matthew chapters 5 through 7 pretty well by Jesus on his Sermon on the Mount. So the law of Moses is a covenant. A covenant is an agreement. It's a legal contract that has binding responsibilities from each party. And that's what God was doing on Mount Sinai. He was establishing a covenant. Now, we have to be careful. The people of Israel did not earn that covenant. They had been slaves in Egypt. God delivered them freely. None of them earned their freedom when they were slaves in Egypt. God didn't go to them and say, "You were the best slaves I've ever seen in my life. I'm going to set you free because you so deserve it." So anybody who tells you that it was a covenant of works, be careful, because they didn't earn their way out of Egypt. They were delivered out of Egypt by God's grace. He did it because he had promised their forefathers that they would be delivered. And so regardless of how they were as people, he delivered them. And he brought them to Mount Sinai. And the day Israel stood before God at Mount Sinai, which is today between the nation of Egypt and the current nation of Israel in the wilderness between those, he met them on this mountain and he said, "Okay, you're free people, you can go wherever you want, but if you want to go forward with me, here is an agreement that you have to draft." And that's what we call today the Covenant of Sinai, the Law of Moses. It had two parts. If you want to be my people, here's the things I expect of you as a nation. But it also had requirements for God. God had to be faithful to the covenant as well. And so the covenant laid out Israel's responsibilities and God's responsibilities, and it also listed out what would happen to each party if the covenant were broken. That's the agreement God made with them at Mount Sinai. It was made with a nation of this earth, the people of Israel. It was intended to build a kingdom on this earth, the kingdom of Israel. So it's a very this earth covenant. God made it with a historic people. You and I are not under that covenant. We're not under that agreement. The New Testament is pretty clear. We are no longer under the law of Moses. We did not come to God through Sinai. We came to God through Jesus. And the covenant you and I have accepted is the covenant of Jesus. Now, don't get worried. Well, you can get worried, but I'm going to allay some of those fears, I hope, because if you think I'm saying that the old covenant doesn't matter anymore, you'd be wrong. We're no longer under that specific agreement, but the principles that underlie that covenant and the God who wrote that covenant, they're the same. So even though we may not be under the agreement that God signed with Israel, the principles that underlie that still remain the principles of God in the world. And so the New Covenant authors, the people who followed Jesus like Paul and the other writers of the New Testament, have no problem going back into the Old Covenant and extracting the principles and values of God out of it, because God doesn't give laws that don't reveal who he is. And the Old Covenant reveals who God is and what he expects of us. So we're not under that law, which means if we break the 10 Commandments, the curses that are listed out in Deuteronomy are not going to come on us because we're not under that agreement. But the things God wanted of Israel, he still wants of us. The new covenant of Jesus is a new covenant God has made with all nations on earth. The old covenant is an agreement he made with one nation on earth. This is the big difference. So the reason I'm starting this way is because before we can wade into Sabbath, we have to allay something that has kept people from honoring it for generations. Isn't that part of the law of Moses? Does that really matter for Christians? But the laws that God gave to Israel still reveal his heart and his character and his desires for humanity. They still reveal those things. We may not be under that agreement, but we are still under the same God. And that should be clear when we begin to read the teachings of Jesus, because Jesus lived in submission to the covenant of Sinai, and all of Jesus' teachings are consistent with it. The Sabbath discussion, Jesus is trying to say to the Pharisees of his day, the leadership of the spiritual leaders of his day, that they had misunderstood the heart of Sabbath from the beginning, and because of that, they had been wrongly applying what God meant to do. But Sabbath still applies for Jesus. Sabbath is still part of what God wants from his people. It's no longer a law like it was in the covenant of Moses, but it is still an expectation. Am I making any sense? Now, the gift of Sabbath is given for our benefit, and that's what I focused on in that sermon a year ago. But it is also a gift from God. Sabbath is a gift to you and to me from God. We think of it as a requirement, like a rule, but it's really a gift. And to refuse that gift reveals a lack of gratitude. It's a lack of gratitude that leads us into most of our rebellions. At the heart of a great deal of human rebellion is a refusal to thank God for the gifts he's given, and a refusal to honor him in the way that we receive them. So as we consider Jesus' attempts to reorient his contemporaries' understanding of the Sabbath, we're going to explore three things. And if you like taking notes, here they are. The first we'll talk about is what the Sabbath was meant to be in the law of Moses. Secondly, we're going to talk about what Sabbath had become in Jesus' day. And third, we're going to try and talk about what Sabbath, I think, is supposed to look like today. So those are our three. That's the road we're going to take here this morning. Let's look at Sabbath in the law of Moses. Now, the Ten Commandments are listed twice in the Bible. They're listed at the very beginning of God's covenant with Israel in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20 is the Ten Commandments. That's given at Mount Sinai when the covenant is first ratified, when Israel read the fine print and signed on the dotted line and said, this is the relationship we accept with God. That happens at the beginning in Exodus 20, and that's where the 10 words, the summary of the rest of the laws, are to be found. But then, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, in the book of Deuteronomy, just before they go into the promised land, Moses reiterates the 10 words. And so there are two 10 commandment lists. The first one is in Exodus 20. The other one is in Deuteronomy chapter 5. We're going to read them both this morning, and I just want you to pay attention to one simple question as we read them. To whom is this law written? To whom is this law written? This is Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. So you're thinking, to whom is that written? Let's look a couple books over in Deuteronomy. After Exodus is Leviticus, Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. Chapter 5, Moses reiterates the law just before they enter the promised land after their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. We're still asking the question, to whom is this written? Who is Sabbath law for? Deuteronomy chapter 5, beginning in verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or female slave or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the resident alien in your town, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So a little different than the Exodus one, but the gist is the same. So here's the question, and this is not rhetorical. You can yell it out. To whom was the Sabbath written? to the employers. It was written to the head of household. Do you see? It wasn't written to the slaves or the children or the animals. It was written to the one in charge of all those people. It was written to the bosses. It was written to the head of the corporations. It was written to those in charge of the schedule. God was requiring in the law that every person who had control of another's work guaranteed them the seventh day off every single week. Not the second day off some weeks, the third day off other weeks, the fifth day off other weeks, but every single seventh. It was written to your employers. But what happened? What happened? There's no doubt that what happened very quickly, and this happened by Jesus' day, is that the powerful took what was a law to employers to guarantee a day off for their employees every single week that they could share. Quickly, the powerful took that as an opportunity to exercise more control over people by policing what other people did on that day. So now the bosses became the boss not only of your week, but also of your day off, because they could judge you for what you did and didn't do. This is what people do. They will not give a day to God. They micromanage every single day. And even to this day, when people don't honor the Sabbath the way some Christians think they should, we're still micromanaging the day God gave to them and poking our fingers at them. This is a day that God has given as a gift to the people of the earth. It was originally written to those in charge of the schedule to require them. This is the first labor law ever put into effect. Employers are not allowed to work their servants 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It's against God's law. And if you're an employer or a manager or an owner and make your people work every day of the week, and you do not give them a Sabbath, you're the one who's on the hook for the Sabbath, not your employees. The Sabbath was written to those in charge of the schedule. But the reason Israel did not live into the Sabbath is because it takes faith to live into the Sabbath. In the law of Moses, the Sabbath was meant to be a faith-building exercise. When God created us, he gave us stewardship over the entire earth. Humans are meant to be God's caregivers of the earth. But at the same time, God gave us a gift. He said more or less, you take care of the earth 6 days and I will take care of it 1 day. You're not responsible for every single day. You're responsible for every 6 days, and on the seventh, if you trust me, I'll care for the things you're neglecting. That was his promise. But Israel were farmers. The Israelites were farmers, and that sounded like crazy talk to most of them. Because if you don't milk your goats 1 day a week, your goats dry up. So farm work and agricultural work takes daily attention. So Israel did not want to honor the Sabbath because they did not trust that God would care for their animals and their crops on the day that they took off. The Sabbath was meant to be a gift to us, but it takes faith to live into it, because any of you who have tried to take a day off from your basic responsibilities will know that trusting God to care for the things you're neglecting takes a whole lot of trust that God's going to show up. And most of us do not believe God's going to show up, and that's why we have no Sabbath rest. So in the law of Moses, the Sabbath was meant to be a safeguard for employees, for workers, for people who would have no control over how many hours they worked or what kind of work they did or how many days they worked. They had no control. So it was a law given to employers to guarantee a day off. Now, in Jesus' day, it had become something else. It had become some sort of a means of control. And that's what Jesus was debating with. If you look back at John chapter 7, verse 21, these are the words we find. Jesus answered them, the Jewish people, I performed one work. This is Jesus who healed a man on the Sabbath 6 months earlier. They really held a grudge. That happened 6 months earlier at Passover, and they're still upset about it. They still want to kill him, and that's why he came to the festival late. So this is a long memory. 6 months earlier, he had performed this miracle. He said, Jesus answered them, I performed one work, and all of you are astonished. Moses gave you circumcision. It's, of course, not from Moses, but from the patriarchs, and you'll circumcise a man on the Sabbath. So Jesus is saying, you let some work be done on the Sabbath. You just didn't like the work I did. So let's talk about how you've completely misunderstood everything about the Sabbath. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath in order that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because I healed a man's whole body on the Sabbath? Don't judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. In Jesus' day, rather than the Sabbath being a grace to workers in honor of God's creation of the world, the Sabbath had become another way in which the powerful sought to exercise control over those they led. God gives us a day off from our responsibilities over creation, and yet the religious leaders in Jesus' day came to believe that the Sabbath was the day you were most responsible for your duties to God. You see the opposite? Sabbath is intended as a day in which one might enjoy the fruits of one's labors. A day on which you might look back after 6 days of work and enjoy what you've accomplished. Where you might let your hair down and release your responsibility to control everything and give a day to God because He said, I won't do your whole life for you, but I'll do 1 day a week if you'll let me. Wouldn't that be great? Most of us don't even give Him the chance to fulfill His promise. That's supposed to be the way your weeks are oriented. For 6 days you labor, and for 6 days you work, and for 6 days you worry about everything, your finances and your retirement and your kids, and you worry about your food and your budget and all the other stuff you have to be, your health and all your concerns. For 6 days you labor. And then on the seventh day, God says, I've got today, take a break. But what do we hear from people that I don't need a day off? In Jesus' day, His contemporaries assumed that when God said don't work on the Sabbath, it was a law. And God was concerned about how much energy you expended on that day. And God was keeping a tally of energy expenditure. And if it was too much energy expended, God was going to judge them for it. That's what they thought Sabbath was all about. So the rabbis had decided how far you could walk before it was work. But the heart of the Sabbath is that God's people would gratefully receive from Him the offer for Him to have 1 day where He took care of your stuff. Sabbath is about gratefully receiving from God a day in which our responsibilities can be handed over to Him and we can rest. So what should the Sabbath be today? Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, we've already read it. I'll just say it again. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them, but rested the seventh day. And therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Now you and I may not be under the law of Moses anymore, but do you notice that God did not root Sabbath law in the law of Moses? Sabbath law is rooted in creation. It's rooted in the way God created the universe at the beginning, thousands and thousands of years before Sinai. Sabbath law isn't about Sinai, it's about the way your God created the universe. And He created the universe in 6 days and took a day off for you. You think He needed a break? He did it for you so that you could take a day off every seventh day. That's what the Sabbath is. Now, we may not be under the covenant of Sinai. That covenant was broken by the people of Israel, and the curses for breaking it have fallen on them. And the Apostle Paul says that even though that covenant is still in effect, anyone who tries to come to God through it can only inherit the curse of the broken covenant. But the principles that undergirded that covenant are still the principles by which God governs the world, and they still undergird the covenant of Jesus. The same God who originally drafted the agreement with Israel has drafted the agreement with all nations in the blood of Jesus. Even more in the Scriptures, the Sabbath, like I said, it predates the covenant of Sinai. So the broken covenant of Sinai doesn't do anything about Sabbath. The Sabbath is a gift God gave to creation at the beginning. God has graced you with responsibility only for 6 out of every 7 days. The Sabbath remains today a gift to us, and I believe those who truly wish to live in gratefulness to God will receive it. We do have to remember 2 things, though, as we think about what it would mean to live into Sabbath today. First, the Sabbath law was written to heads of household, so we should stop looking at the workers and start looking at the employers. Second, we no longer live in a culture in which all people can be oriented to the same schedule. Remember, the covenant God made with Israel was a covenant for a kingdom of this earth. And so He expected everyone in that culture would be on the same schedule. They would start counting day 1 on the same day, and the Sabbath would fall on the same day for everyone. That's a kingdom of this earth. We no longer live in that kind of a culture. You and I have been scattered as exiles throughout the nations of the earth as salt and light, and therefore you and I cannot control the culture schedule. So the way we live into Sabbath will be different because we're no longer in charge of the schedule the way Israel was intended to be, and yet Sabbath is still a gift given to us. You know, there are some churches that are all organized around the fact that we're doing it wrong, that we have often elected the Sabbath to be Sunday when in fact the seventh day is Saturday. And my response is usually the same. Well, it depends on when you start counting. Can anybody quote me chapter and verse on what day has to be day one? Where is it? Where does it say Sunday has to be the first day of the week? Where? Nowhere. Now, of course, they'd all be on the same schedule in Israel because it was a kingdom of this earth. But the point of God is that you would have a Sabbath rest every seventh day. He never tells you when to start counting. Nowhere in the law does he designate what day is day one. He just says every seventh is a Sabbath rest for the people of God. We don't live in a culture where people are oriented to the same schedule. So I think that gives us some freedom as people living in this culture to count however we want and make sure that every seventh day we can take a Sabbath. Thankfully, the law never prescribed day one, so it gives you some flexibility for living in exile. And that's where we are. The Sabbath, though, is not a law any longer. We're not under the covenant of Moses. There are not prescribed curses for you breaking the Sabbath. That law has been broken. But still the Sabbath is a gift. And how we receive a gift says a lot about our gratefulness to the gift giver and our faith in his capacity to give good and life-giving gifts to his children. I wish every family would receive every seventh day as a gift from God and set aside the work they do for their living and instead use that day to enjoy the fruits of their labors. I wish you would do that. It would change your life. I really believe it would. Secondly, I wish every Christian organization would set aside a Sabbath day every seventh day on which no meetings or church work is done, irrespective of how convenient or inconvenient it may be for the people of God. Sabbath was never about convenience. It was about faith in God, and we should have faith in him. That's my belief. Third, I wish every person who follows Jesus would remember that the Sabbath is more than a day off every seventh day. This is just the beginning of Sabbath law. We won't get into it today, but the Sabbath is also a cycle of every 7 years and a cycle of every 50 years. It includes care for the poor. It includes the cancellation of debts. It includes the giving back of property that had to be sold. I mean, the Sabbath law was a way of rebooting the entire system of Israel. So we won't get into that today. We could at least start by practicing once a week, and maybe we could get to the bigger matters, which happen every 7 years and every 50th year. But we can't even get past the week, We can't even receive God's gift of a week. Sabbath is more than just a day off a week. It's beginning to live into a pattern that has ramifications for all of our lives. It's just the beginning. It's like the sandbox practice for the bigger life that God calls us into. So at least we could start by building our faith by entrusting one day a week to God, and then maybe we'll have faith to move mountains one day. Maybe we will. We can't even trust him one day a week. How in the world can he do anything else with us? 4, I wish the people of God would recognize that Sabbath is a gift of God to every person. And out of that knowledge, we would stop trying to control what other people do on their Sabbath. It's a day given to them by God. They will answer to God for their use of it. They do not have to answer to you or to me. It is a gift to them, so let's just stop it. 5th, in short, I wish the people of God would gratefully receive what God has given and receive it in faith, trusting God to handle the consequences of what it would mean to receive a Sabbath from him. And how much we trust him is revealed in what we do or do not do with Sabbath. And it's harder for some of us than others. If you work a white-collar job, you have an easier task because you're probably given 2 days off a week. This is hardest on people who work in agriculture, farming, own their own business. It's way harder for them because they're responsible 7 days a week. Take a lot more faith for them than it will for a white-collar worker who gets 2 days off. So let's not judge each other either, because it's easier for some of us than others. But the gift is for all of us. The gift is for all of us. I wish we could get it, church, because I really, really believe that some of where we are as a culture goes right back to the people of Israel and why they were where they were as a culture. It's because we refuse to believe God will fulfill his end of these bargains. and we take responsibility ourselves to do God's work for him. We lost the Sabbath because we didn't trust God. It's nobody else's fault. It's because we didn't trust God. Let's receive this gift from God. The law is not meant to be a burden to you. God's requirements are meant to be a gift. True freedom comes in following his law. God's law for you is for your good. It may feel like restriction, but it will always be grace if we would just receive it. Sabbath is not a law. It's a gift. And I beg you to receive it.